Hello everyone, this is Space Cafe Podcast and I am Marcus. Let me take you on a journey today, a truly wild ride through a series of questions that have been puzzling me and hopefully you out there as well for a long time. I mean, when, if not now, can we think big, really big? The space industry is experiencing a golden age, so the visions cannot be big enough, right? And this episode is dedicated to the big shots, the very big shots. So, for example, what about new rocket engines that we only know from science fiction movies? When will we see the first permanent habitats on celestial bodies outside the Earth? Why are there still no Star Trek type spaceships? What has become of the legendary space elevator that is supposed to take us all quickly and cheaply into space? And last but not least, when will we finally see the solar power plants in orbit that author Isaac Asimov dreamed of and that will send us limitless energy to Earth? My guest today has something to say about all of this because his unique biography has already allowed him to deal with most of the questions raised here.
So my name is John C. Mankins. I spent 25 years at NASA, 10 years at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and 15 years at NASA headquarters. I'm probably best known for having written the first full definitions of the TRLs, the technology readiness levels, which are an ISO standard for assessing maturity in technology. I'm also quite active in looking at the future of humanity with regard to the moon and in pursuing ideas and activities relating to space solar power, harvesting solar energy in space and delivering it to Earth.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope we can bring you as much joy and inspiration with the next 50 minutes as the production itself has brought us. It is my pleasure to present to you John Mankins. Before we get right into all those topics you just mentioned, you must have had a pretty impressive business card because, you used to work at the Office for Advanced Concepts and Technology at NASA. How cool is that? And is it true that it's called Code C?
It was briefly Code C back in the late 1980s. Most of the time I was in that organization, it was Code R for Research and Technology. Goes back to the 1960s, the Office of Advanced Research and Technology. And then it became briefly Code T. There was a part of it that was Code C.
That's pretty nerdy.
And then later on, it was dissolved, and I transitioned into the Office of Spaceflight, where I was the chief technologist for a while.
So, but seriously, do you, holding that business card, do you drop it in random places in bars to just show off?
Not anymore. I actually these days I have several business cards for different purposes. And I drop one depending on what the topic is.
Nice. So, John, I'd love to talk a little bit about your expertise when it comes to powering places in orbit, powering places, interplanetary places. But so, first question, how will the first moon base be powered? Because when we talk about moon bases and future habitats, we talk about what they will look like and the astronauts and the transportation, but we never talk about the actual power sources. So what will that look like?
The current consensus is that early human missions to the moon again, when they happen again, sometime in this decade, that they will occur to the lunar south polar region. Mm-hmm. And the poles of the moon are such that the sunlight, like at the poles of the Earth, the Arctic and Antarctic, the sun comes in obliquely. Mm-hmm. But because the terrain is hilly, so robust because of craters and canyons and mountains, you don't have the sun in the sky all the time like you do, say, in the Arctic. So I think probably the earliest missions will go to some location at the South Pole in a place that's on a hill where the sun will be shining during the week or so that the astronauts are there. Now, when you get to the point of wanting to do an outpost on the moon, I think it'll be probably a hybrid with solar arrays sticking up like flags so they can catch the sunlight when it's passing by obliquely, and probably some batteries or fuel cells, and probably some backup nuclear power systems just in case everything else fails.
But
it'll be a combination.
That's the tricky thing, because nuclear hasn't made its way into orbit or into space for security reasons so far.
It's more difficult to get approval, but there are a number of nuclear power sources.
Voyager
typically,
probes.
With the Voyager probes, also the most recent U.S. rover on Mars, Perseverance, has a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, RTG.
Okay. So good. So we got nuclear power, we got solar power. So we should be all set. So when do you think, by the way, as you're an expert very close to where things are going on when it comes to future habitats, when will we be ready to have or to see a permanent outpost on the moon? Not just as visitors.
Right. So this is a really interesting topic because there's, as is true with so many things, there's been international competition going on. So the U.S. has announced the Artemis program. Right. A number of countries have signed up to Artemis. The existing planning for Artemis kind of centers around the preparation for human missions to Mars in the 2030s. And it proposes to do long-term things on the lunar surface that are related to going to Mars. However, at the same time, in the last 4 years, there's been a tremendous amount of new emphasis on the lunar ices, the development of lunar resources, which could be immensely valuable in the use of and the transportation in the cost of operations in what is called cislunar space, the Earth-Moon system writ large. At the same time, this is all the planning for Artemis, and the Chinese National Space Agency and Roscosmos have just announced, like 6 weeks ago, they just announced a plan at an International Academy of Astronautics conference in St. Petersburg to deploy an international lunar research station to be a permanent outpost on the moon and another one in lunar orbit. And they're inviting participation by countries all over the world in the ILR, as it is called in its acronym. And you have these two different plans, no clear date for when there will actually be an outpost on the moon. My opinion is probably within 10 years.
Wow, that's pretty close. Have we been ever any closer to realizing, to making this become a reality? Or is this the real thing that we're experiencing?
The closest we were was right at the beginning of the Apollo landings at Apollo 11. So 1969, because the U.S. had the Saturn V, we had the lunar lander, we had the Apollo command module, we had all the pieces we needed to begin deploying to the lunar surface. But then, because that was all a hugely expensive set of equipment, and the Nixon administration had other priorities, like balancing the budget, they cut those expenditures. Today, we're not quite as close yet, but momentarily, there will be, on the NASA side, the SLS. On the commercial side, there will be Starship. Already, there's the Falcon 9 reusable, heavy and reusable 9, the reusable and the heavy reusable. Coming from Blue Origin, you have the New Glenn launcher shortly. And this will actually be, from the standpoint of fiscal feasibility, as opposed to technical feasibility, This will be even closer within 2-3 years because the cost of these launchers is like 10% of the cost of the Saturn V. And so when you have the capability and the price is 90% cheaper,
Wow.
suddenly the moon becomes 90% closer in terms of fiscal realism.
So this must be a dream coming true or almost coming true for you, because you were heavily invested in finding affordable ways to go into space during your time. I think at NASA that was. So are we there yet?
In terms of changing people's minds. So in the 1990s, as you alluded to, I did studies on how the cost of access to space could be cut by 90%. It was a study called the Highly Reusable Space Transportation Study. And one of the key strategies for doing that was to somehow have a leg up on what's called the rocket equation. Because the Earth is a little bit too big to get into space conveniently. So it's a good thing, because otherwise we wouldn't have an atmosphere and we wouldn't be alive. But the strategy that SpaceX has followed with the Falcon 9 reusable and that Blue Origin is following on the New Glenn has now been proven, i.e. the reusable first stage booster, has now been proven to be technically viable. China's now following it. The European Space Agency is looking at it. There is now no doubt that this approach works. Whereas 25 years ago, when I was studying it, it was just paper and nobody really believed it, even though it had been proven by a good friend, Dr. Inatane sensei at the Japanese Space Agency had already done tests of vertical takeoff, vertical landing back in the 1990s. And DARPA, with a company that now no longer exists, McDonnell Douglas, had done the Delta Clipper, then later the Clipper Graham, which went vertical takeoff and vertical landing. So we were so close. And then all of that was canceled, both in Japan and in the US.
For what
and
reason?
It waited for, I think fundamentally, it was too different from what everyone was thinking at that moment. They knew about expendable launch vehicles. They knew about space shuttle type, partially reusable systems. And this was frankly radically different, a reusable booster, and it just didn't survive. It couldn't survive the constant pressure on the budget.
So it was
and people didn't believe it.
It was all a little too early, as was Apollo, in fact.
But not technically, but only in terms of people's commitment.
Mindset.
Yeah, their mindset.
Fascinating. So let's go back to the 1990s. You published a report back in the day, a fresh look at solar power. So 30 years later, what became of the idea?
Oh, don't exaggerate. It's only 26 years later.
Okay, that's it. Yeah.
So I got involved in this topic, space solar power, because I was managing advanced concept studies at the time, and my boss said to take a look at it because there had been a lot of work in the 1970s. All of that was canceled because the costs were exorbitant using the technologies of the 1970s. And my boss said, look to see if there are new technologies that enable new kinds of system concepts that could change the cost equation, that could radically reduce the cost, both the recurring cost and the upfront cost of doing space solar power. And the answer that we came to in the Fresh Look study was yes. And the architectural approach that's made possible by the advances that occurred during the 20 years between the mid-1970s and the mid-1990s had to do with electronics, robotics, materials, and mass production. The idea that you could take a huge space system and make it out of many mass-produced modules fundamentally changes the cost equation for big space ventures. And so that was the finding at the time. It went on the relapse. It vanished because, which is a terrible bit of English, but as a result of the cancellation of all the investments in low-cost launch is going to be expensive forever. Why you think about space solar power? Since the last 10 years, all of those technologies, advances in solid state electronics, advances in materials, advances in robotics, all of those things have continued to progress. And as of today, frankly, the opportunities for those technical solutions to space solar power have never been more viable.
Mm-hmm. Because technology has needed that time to mature and get ready.
Oh, we could have done it faster if we'd had an actual focused R&D program.
Mm-hmm.
But these advances are so fundamental in so many ways. They have continued to advance for other purposes, and now they are available and on the shelf for space solar power.
So what is the difference between solar power in space and solar power on Earth?
So the fundamental component technology, the photovoltaic array, which goes back to the 1950s, is the same. So that is fundamentally the same. But what you do with the electricity is quite different. So in the case of a terrestrial solar array, it's either on your rooftop or it's in a power plant. It generates power when the sun is shining. If it's on your rooftop, it has a fixed angle, and it generates the maximum power when the sun is in the exact right spot in the sky. And otherwise, you get losses due to the angle, the cosine of the angle of the sun on the solar array. It's hard to explain these things without a whiteboard. In the case of a big solar plant, sometimes the arrays point, usually they don't, because pointing arrays are challenging.
Mm-hmm.
In a space solar power system, you put the solar harvesting elements, the solar arrays, the PV arrays, on a large platform.
Mm-hmm.
The electricity is used to generate a radio, in the cases that I've looked at, a radio frequency transmission, usually in the microwave regime, which has a wavelength between 2 and 12 centimeters. So it wavelengths about the size of your hand. And then that transmission is sent to the Earth, where it is then received by a kind of receiver called a rectifying antenna, or rectenna.
Fascinating. So how far can you go with that?
So the trick, of course, is if you've ever been to the opening of a new store or some business, and they have spotlights out in the parking lot. Of course, none of that has happened during the era of COVID. But back in the old days, like 2 years ago, you go to a movie opening or you see something like the bat signal, like Batman with the bat signal. The spotlight, as the beam of light goes farther and farther from the source, it gets broader and broader.
Right.
It widens. Well, even with a coherent transmission, like a microwave beam from a solar power satellite, it's coherent. So the waves are all in step with each other. It still spreads. So there's still a diffraction limit to the degree to which the beam can be perfectly collimated, meaning all the rays of energy, all the rays of the electromagnetic beam going in exactly the same direction. So as you get further and further away from the source, it spreads more and more.
Why not use lasers?
So this is a big debate within the community. There are some people who are very fond of lasers. I'm not one of them. And I've looked at both over the years. There are several reasons for that. One, first and foremost, lasers have a lot of difficulty in traveling through clouds or haze. And if space solar power is going to compete with ground solar power, it has to be available essentially all the time. So you can't lose the energy from a solar power satellite when it's a rainy day, because that's just stupid. Because if that happens, you might as well use ground solar. So one of the big economic advantages of space solar is it's 24/7. It's available 99.95% of the time. With a laser, it's not. Some places, like for example Singapore, you can have 2 weeks or 3 weeks of overcast. You use lasers, you lose it. You can't get the energy from your satellite.
No light.
So economically, it's a dog. Now, in terms of the risk of militarization of the system, I'm a firm believer in civil space solar power, civil and commercial, for the broad public marketplace. for me, that's the reason to believe in space solar power.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want it to be readily weaponized. And if you had a 1,000 megawatt laser up in space, how would you guarantee to people that it could not be weaponized? So for those two reasons, the economics and the risk of weaponization, I don't follow,
Sure.
I don't pursue, I don't endorse, I don't promote
Sure.
laser wireless power transmission.
Fascinating. But where's the advantage of producing that kind of energy in space as opposed to producing it on Earth? Because you have Earth, you have sunlight on Earth as
right.
well.
Yeah, absolutely. But you only have the sunlight on Earth when the sun shines. And if you look at any place where people actually live, Germany, Chicago, Tokyo, Moscow, huge swings in the amount of sunlight that's available between the winter and the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And during the rainy season, everywhere people live has a rainy season. You can have overcasting clouds for weeks at a time. And the big advantage of ground-based solar, now that it has gotten to be very cheap with PV arrays, is that when the sun is shining, you can have power. You can have power right at your home. The disadvantage is you have almost no power when it's wintertime. You have no power at late in the day, like in the early morning, when the sun is low in the sky, or early in the morning or late in the afternoon, you have almost no power.
Mm-hmm.
And you need, for good sunny locations like Phoenix, Arizona, you might get away with big batteries,
Mm-hmm.
where you have solar arrays and batteries, because you don't have a lot of rain. But in Berlin, in Moscow, in Paris, in London, in Chicago, in New York, in Tokyo, in Beijing, all of these places you have a rainy season. You cannot put in enough batteries for 2 or 3 weeks of overcast.
Mm-hmm.
That's where space solar power complements ground solar power. Because when it is overcast, when it is nighttime, you can provide power from a solar power satellite
Mm-hmm.
to any place on the Earth that the solar power satellite can see. And so I really see the two, ground solar and space solar, as being complementary.
So how, from a technical perspective, how feasible is it? So is it doable? I guess you prototyped that project back in the day.
Well, and we actually built a test system, very low power, but all the physics worked, all the engineering worked, PV cells, sunlight into electricity through wiring and electronic circuits into an antenna, and then transmitted it, very tiny power from the crest of Haleakala on the island of Hawaii, island of Maui in Hawaii, to the big island of Hawaii, a distance of about 140 kilometers. So the physics, but going back earlier, the physics of wireless power transmission was proven by a brilliant man, Bill Brown, back in the 1960s, which is what led Peter Glaser to invent the solar power satellite in 1968. But so the physics and the basic technology of space solar power is what makes communication satellites work. But they use the same technologies for information transmission rather than for power transmission. So it's really in the architecture, how you put those pieces together, how you deploy them, that allows you to now really look at economically feasible space solar power.
So I guess you just came off a call with Elon or Jeff and asked them to invest a little bit of their pocket money in some. No, seriously, where are those projects in reality? Why don't we have something like this yet?
It's exactly the same answer as the answer to the question, our conversation a moment ago about low-cost launch. I was studying low-cost launch 25 years ago, and there was nothing that prevented it from being done in the late 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamental prototypes were tested in Japan. They were tested at McDonnell Douglas. They existed, and then the whole thing was dropped because it was too different. It was too far beyond people's expectations. Today, still, with space solar power, this continues to be the fundamental challenge. I had a good conversation at a venture capital event I went to several years ago in Silicon Valley. And there were 6 investors. They described how across all the different VC funds in Silicon Valley, there were approximately 150 different plays, i.e. investment strategies, concerning low-cost launch. Now, there's not a sufficient market for 150 launchers. And the 150 included New Glenn for Blue Origin. It included SpaceX, Falcon 9 reusable. It included Rocket Lab. It included The reason they all had 150 different investments was because it was a sine qua non of being in Silicon Valley and being outside the back gate of Stanford. You had to have an investment in a rocket because all the good investment funds had investments in rockets. Nobody has an investment in solar power satellites. And because nobody has one, nobody wants to touch it. So it's the fundamental barrier is belief.
So what kind of investment are we talking about? So let's compare that to, I don't know, what can it be compared with? A launch to the International Space Station with a new module, an extension module. So we know there is a price tag to that. Let's compare that to setting up a solar power factory in orbit.
So the space solar power, just like space launch, just lots of things, the cost all depends on how you do it. So if you want to do space solar power the way it was studied and the way it was looked at in the 1970s, the cost would be hundreds of billions of dollars for the first one, maybe $1 trillion for the first one.
Okay.
However, if you do it using all the things that have been made possible by advances in technology over the past 40 years, solid state electronics with high efficiency, high strength to weight materials that are very low cost, mass production, 3D printing of structural systems, completely automated fabrication of electronics, automated manufacturing. All of these things are possible, and they make the modern world feasible. Mobile phones, wireless routers, portable computers, laptops, all of these things, the software that goes into them, none of those existed 40 years ago. We take them all for granted. Very few of them have found their way into space systems design. So following this course and coming back to your question, if you do space solar power in a highly modular architecture that can be essentially make a huge system out of pieces, each one of which is about the size of a briefcase. So maybe 3 to 10 kilograms. And you mass produce those, then this is like a 3U form factor CubeSat, it's a small size, and plus some booms and so on. It's like making a model of the Empire State Building out of Legos, to give a brand endorsement, or Tinker Toys, which is another one. If you make a very large system out of very small building blocks, those building blocks can be mass produced. Then an initial ground-based demo is probably about $40-50 million. An initial low Earth orbit demo is probably around $250 million. And the first power plant delivering tens of megawatts of power to the Earth is on the order of $1 billion. And full-scale systems, and it goes up with industrial scale, full-scale systems delivering 1 gigawatt or 2 gigawatts to markets on the Earth would be maybe $10 billion and about 10 years.
How many launches would you need to set up one factory?
Oh, so the trick, it's like if you think about honeybees, there is no factory. Honeybees are the factory. So the solar power satellite would basically have with it'd have pieces like Legos and blocks like Tinker Toys, and there would be the bees, the ants, that would assemble it. And they'd live on the they'd live metaphorically. They would live on the platform. There would be no factory. The thing would assemble itself and deploy itself The same way that a swarm of bees follow the queen and they build the hive. Similarly, the robots, a group of robots would build the platform and then they would stay with it to maintain it and repair it and take care of it.
And what orbit would those systems?
My current thinking is that for the initial test in space, it would be a low Earth orbit. And the platform, this is that initial platform for maybe, so first the $50 million ground demo, then the $250 million space demo, and that would be in a low Earth orbit. And then the tens of megawatts system for about $1 billion, that would be in a middle Earth orbit. So maybe 7, 8, 9,000 kilometers, because it's easier to transmit the energy when you're closer. This is just an initial pilot plant. And then the full-scale systems in a geostationary Earth orbit at 35,000 kilometers altitude, where a satellite in a geostationary orbit has a unique feature that it appears to stay fixed in the sky above a given spot on the Earth, because the period of orbital rotation is 24 hours, and the period of a day is 24 hours.
You know what? I think to set all those things up, we would need that space elevator too. So, any news on that?
Yeah, it's kind of a catch-22 though. For any major new infrastructure, you need to have a market. And so I think the same thing is true. Like people talk about making pieces of the solar power satellite on the moon. This is only feasible if there's a solar power satellite market into which to sell the pieces that you make. So, and I think one of the huge shifts in the last 5 years are these massive investments by Musk and Bezos in very low cost launch, even though there wasn't existing a market at the moment they started investing. So they have gambled in a way that public servants would not.
Yes. So let's get back to that elevator question. Is there any elevator on the horizon, or is it like fusion type energy production that's always 40 years in the future?
I think the space elevator certainly has good champions and is a very beautiful concept. Going back to Arthur C. Clarke, I think it's an appealing idea, but I think it's a very difficult, and I have very good friends who are strong champions. Dr. Peter Swan is a very strong champion and others. But for myself, I do think it's very challenging. There are other ideas for very low cost launch, even lower than Starship. But if Starship actually does get launched and they rolled out the first stage, Elon is claiming that because of the low-cost manufacturing and using it 100 or 200 or 300 times, the cost of launch will be below $200 a kilogram to low Earth orbit.
Wow.
Now, compare that to, say, the Atlas V at more than $20,000 a kilogram to low Earth orbit. So that's a 99% reduction in cost. I really think that, and I believe New Glenn will be similar, the one from Blue Origin. So when these launchers are flying, I think they will dominate the middle range market. For small payloads will be on different launchers, but those costs are going to be so fabulously low. It's going to be amazing.
Just out of personal curiosity and total envy, have you personally seen the Super Heavy yet, or parts of it?
No. I haven't gone to Texas, and it's only been during COVID.
Yeah,
that the pieces, the Starship second stage and the Super Heavy first stage, that the Super Heavy first stage only rolled out last week.
Yeah.
Or this week, only rolled out this week.
I
haven't seen it.
I think we all saw that photo with all the engines attached. So that's pretty fascinating to see. I think we're all super curious to watch it launch at some point.
By the way, so just as a highlight, the Russians in the 1960s had a very similar architecture for their big booster as a competitor to the Saturn V. So the Saturn V had 5 really huge engines. And the Russians went with a different strategy, which was to have a very massively parallel launch first stage with lots and lots of identical small engines. And the dilemma, one of the dilemmas at that time was that it was all based on analog control. The transformation, and it's not that it was a bad idea, but it couldn't be done with the technologies they had. It's a great idea. And it's exactly what Musk is doing. It's exactly what SpaceX is doing. They're doing lots and lots of small engines. But today, you have massively parallel and smart electronic controls. So they can detect and adjust and modify. And if an engine over here goes out, they can immediately shut off the engine that's opposite to it. And so they have a tremendous advantage on where the Russians were, the former Soviet Union space agency was back in the 1960s. And even though it's a very complex plumbing job, I believe the secret sauce is all in the software and the control systems.
Fascinating.
Not the pipes and the plumbing.
But still we're burning fuel to lift us up into space, into orbit. Do you see any fundamental changes in that kind of technology to produce completely different ways of propellant or methods of propelling hardware into space?
Well, one of the concepts a good friend of mine looked at, who's now passed, and which I looked at in the 1990s based on some of his ideas, it was Jim Powell, who was one of the co-inventors of superconducting maglev, electromagnetic levitation, back in the 1960s. And the idea is to completely substitute the first stage, which is the reusable first stage, which SpaceX has developed for the Falcon 9 and reusable, and is developing for Starship, the same kind of reusable first stage that the Blue Origin is doing for the New Glenn. The idea there was to completely replace that and use an electromagnetic catapult.
Seriously.
So seriously, there's all you really want is an initial vector, an initial velocity vector that gets you off the ground and part of the way to orbit.
But that's some serious acceleration. How many
No,
G's
you
would
just
I
have
pull?
You just have a big track. You design the system based on 3Gs or 4Gs or 5Gs. So it's not a gun. It's not a gun where you get 50,000 Gs. You build a track that is maybe 20 kilometers long, and which is about the size of the Denver International Airport. And you accelerate and bit up. And you don't have to go all the way, because if you look at the physics of rocket combustion and the rocket equation, and do you ever see the Saturn V take off, the video of the Saturn V taking
absolutely.
off? The first 5, 10, 20 seconds, all of the engines are firing at full throttle and it barely moves.
Yes.
All of that power, all of that fuel is being burned just to fight gravity. And it's not until the vehicle starts to get lighter and lighter as the fuel is burning away that the engines have enough power, enough force to start to accelerate it. If you had a catapult, it's just like on an aircraft carrier with a catapult. If you have a catapult, you can get that initial velocity without the rockets.
Wow. So it's like a railgun?
And then it maglev. Not a railgun is too fast. It's like 50 Gs.
Yeah, okay.
There's no point to this if you break everything inside the cargo bay.
Absolutely. So I feel like we're in a real beautiful science fiction / science fact mood right now. So let me take total advantage of you having such a wide knowledge in so many fields. And there's a question that I've been asking myself for so many years. Why is there no Star Trek type spaceship yet out there?
Yeah. So the dilemma is that the physics as we know it does not allow you to move without either rocket propulsion or some kind of force against a fixed object like the maglev system we were just talking about. So there is no known physics that would allow us to simply somehow grab space itself and pull ourselves forward like a swimmer moving through the Olympic pool in Tokyo. And so we have it's unfortunately, the ideas are very beautiful, but the universe doesn't seem to provide for them. Maybe someday, but
but even if we drop the elusive warp drive and stuff like that, because this may be a little problematic to realize, but if we stay a little lower from a technological perspective, are you seeing still the same problem with the vastness of space and nothing to pull against or push against?
So the tools that we have, if you're willing to make the investment, are sufficient for us to send, for example, probes to nearby star systems. The amount of energy that's necessary is similar to the amount of power that's generated by the Earth, all of humanity's activities in a day. So we have we are literally harnessing power levels, energy amounts that are sufficient to send probes to nearby stars. The real issue is intensity. So and we have this wonderful source of energy, a gravitationally confined thermonuclear reactor sitting in the sky 149 million kilometers away. So we have the source, but we would need, and we have the technology at the component level. We could build energy collection stations that could beam the energy using technology very similar to the solar power satellite. They could beam the energy that they harvest in a collimated beam to a vessel and accelerate it to a reasonable fraction of the speed of light, i.e. 1 or 2%. So
would that be that solar sail idea? Would that be something like this?
It is one approach. The dilemmas with solar sails tend to be that they can only handle very tiny payloads. And what you'd really like to do is to somehow be able to get to the other star system and slow down.
It's tricky with the solar sail because
otherwise you just go zoop.
Right. You'd need a couple of years to slow down.
There's some details to be worked out.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for those insights. Where do you, John, see us on a maturity scale of a technologically advanced species at the moment? Are we advanced? Or where are we? So let's compare ourselves to the lifespan of a human being. Where do you see ourselves?
I think that there are wild disparities in the level of technology that exists in some countries in laboratories as opposed to in the same country in the hands of ordinary citizens. And then if you look at some countries versus other countries, there are wild disparities in the technology that's available in people's hands versus others. So to some extent, the world has changed completely in the last 20 years. If you think about what you would regard as wizardry 500 years ago, for example, the ability to see someone at 20,000 kilometers away and talk to them in real time.
Smartphone,
face
that's
to face.
Wizardry.
The ability to speak to a whole group of people who you haven't seen in years, suddenly, just from a thing in your hand, and so on. So the technologies that we take for granted in solid-state electronics, in networks, in global communications, those areas have made huge advances. But on the other hand, some technologies, we could be on the verge of advances, some capabilities. For example, the human lifespan in the United States has dropped by 18 months in the last 2 years because of COVID. So the expectation, the expected lifespan has dropped, not grown. So what about all the dreams of living 100 years or 200 years or longer in good health? Those things are talked about. There are investments. Nobody yet has made the breakthrough. So some areas we've have complete revolution, and others we are still approximately where we were 100 years ago.
Fascinating. John, we're coming to the end of our beautiful conversation. I can't believe it. That's been such a short while now. We do have a fun tradition at the end of our podcast we do here, and that is in Austria, we love to drink coffee. And this is maybe why we call it a Space Cafe podcast. And you guys in California also love coffee. That's at least the impression I have from my visits. So let's have an espresso for the mind to energize ourselves. So please, John, you're free to share whatever kind of energizing piece of inspiration, advice, story, or whatever you would like to share with me or with the audience that you would think is worth sharing and could energize our audience and bring us to new levels. You can pick any kind of topic, whatever comes up.
So one thing that I'm doing a lot lately, I'm working on a lot lately, but has not really come up very much in our conversation, but we've touched on the fringes of it, is obviously we talked about space solar power and about all of those things, but one other transformation, which is coming and coming soon, that will affect people, especially young people around the world, when the cost of launch is 1% of the cost of getting into space 6-8 years ago, when the cost of getting into space has been reduced by 99%. It means that the cost of going and doing things on the moon will be reduced by 99%. It'll still be more, but it's like a gear. It's like a gear ratio. If it costs me so much to get into space and it costs me 10 times more to get to the moon, if it's $20,000 a kilogram to get into space, then it's $200,000 to get to the moon, and it's $2 million to get down to the moon surface. Well, once the cost of getting into space is reduced by 99%, which is coming fast, it means that all of the ideas going back for 100 years, the science fiction of the moon, developing lunar resources, living on the moon, settlements on the moon, all of this becomes possible. And so instead of it being a game where it's meant to cost $1 billion or $2 billion per person to go to the moon, suddenly it will be a few million. And even though a few million is a lot, it's not an unthinkable amount. And so I think that the number of countries that can be involved in lunar activities, lunar resource development, lunar agriculture, farming, space tourism. There's been a lot of activities this summer on space tourism, lunar visitors, lunar tourism, whether for companies or governments or ordinary people. People will, I think within 10 years, within 8 years, people will win the lottery in countries where that's legal. And one of the things they'll be given is the option. You can either have $10 million or you can go to the moon. This accessibility will penetrate. You'll see programs in Egypt, in Kuwait, in Australia, in not just in China, the US, and Russia, in Canada, in France, all going to the moon. All just like today, you see all over the world kids in university working on CubeSats because now sending a CubeSat to orbit is really cheap. 10 years, maybe less, maybe 8 years. The same thing will be true for the moon. And university students and companies and people all over the world will think of the moon as being part of the Earth. And this will be such a stupendous change in what's possible that it'll transform lives and expectations all over the world.
Fascinating. I'm already seeing moon border control. Wonderful. John Mankins, thank you.
Not in my part of the moon.
John Mankins, thank you so much for the time and that super inspiring conversation just now.
My pleasure.
If you want to stay up to date with all the things we've just been discussing here, I highly recommend subscribing to SpaceWatch.Global's newsletter. For the super nerds among you, there's an extended version. For all others with little time, there is the most important content in a condensed time envelope. Thanks for being here today. To all of you, I hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think at podcast@spacewatch.global. And of course, you can find us on the social networks as well. I'm looking forward to next time. Stay with us.